Hello and welcome to Calcio Collective, the ITOC Italian soccer panel, a podcast about Serie A soccer and all things Italian football from a North American perspective. I'm Alf De Blasis in Toronto, and thank you for joining us for this 12th and final episode of the season. And let me introduce you to my fellow panelists this week. They are all respected football journalists, expert soccer analysts, and Serie A supporters. But first of all, he is a contributor to Italian Football Daily and JuveFC.com. He is also the president of the Bianconeri YYZ Supporters Club. So he is, of course, a proud Juventus fan, and he is Rocco Fasano. Welcome back, Rocco.
Thank you very much for having me on. Pleasure.
Pleasure having you back. At Catenaccio NA is how you can reach him on Twitter. And next, she is the co-founder of Unusual Efforts and a regular contributor to canpl.ca. She also appears frequently on TLN's Serie A halftime show. She is also the co-founder of social media marketing agency Clavis Social, and she's a self-proclaimed Udinese sufferer. She is the one and only Sonia Cori Misio. Welcome back, Sonia.
Thank you so much for having me. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thank you so
Excellent.
much for coming back on the program. Sonia Misio, or at Sonia Misio, is how you can reach her on Twitter. And finally, he is a freelance contributor to publications such as Gentleman Ultra, These Football Times, and Urban Pitch. And he also writes for the official AS Roma website. He is a loyal Roma supporter, and he joins us today from Jersey City, New Jersey. He's Wayne Gerard. Welcome, Wayne.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Ready to talk some calcio.
Absolutely. At Wayne in Rome is his Twitter handle. Thank you all very much for joining me this week. Now, just as an aside, Rocco and Sonia were my very first guest panelists on the premiere episode of this podcast way back in early March. And since then, the world literally changed overnight. As we know, the worldwide pandemic shut down Italian soccer and most other sports around the globe that very week. And rather than suspend this podcast right at the outset, we chose to continue the program and discuss how the coronavirus was impacting sports and Italian soccer in particular. And here we are now, 20 weeks later, looking back on a most unusual season in Serie A, a season that concluded a week or so ago, and we've had some time now to reflect on some of the outcomes and issues and storylines, and we'll discuss those in detail. We'll also consider some of the key performers of the season. And later in the program, we'll look ahead to next season and the newly promoted teams, as well as some of the new players confirmed or rumored to be coming to Italy. Plus, we'll consider this question: is Serie A a sleeping giant? And finally, we'll look ahead to the UEFA Nations League and the long-awaited return to international competition of the Italian national team. But first, let's begin with the just completed 2019-20 campaign, one marked obviously by a very lengthy and unprecedented mid-season interruption. And while one thing has remained constant, and that is that Juventus has won another Scudetto, their 9th consecutive championship. Congratulations, Rocco, on that. I would suggest to you that how they won it could be a foreshadowing to what may be a return to a more competitive Italian league. Consider that prior to this season, in the past 8 years, Juventus has won the Italian league title by an average margin of just under 10 points over their closest rival. Some years they won it by as much as 17 points. Some years they won it by as few as 4. But this season, that winning margin was only a single point, 83 to Inter's 82. And over and above that, two other teams, Atalanta and Lazio, finished within 5 points of the champion. So here's my first question to all of you. Given these statistics, is the gap between Juventus and its nearest challengers starting to close? Are we perhaps witnessing the beginning of the end of this Juventus championship dynasty? And why don't I start with the Juventus supporter, Rocco?
Thank you very much. Thank you. No, I was somewhat arrogantly smirking at that question, to be completely honest. I believe that the post-COVID, or the post-lockdown, I should say, because we were still very much in dealing with COVID internationally. as well as here in Canada, definitely did give an opportunity for quite a few teams to catch up and to narrow that gap. And of course, we saw Inter finish just 1 point behind Juventus, and we saw a bunch of teams play really, really well and perform and outperform the league leaders throughout that period. But overall, I feel that Juventus still commands a huge slice of the market, still has the biggest payroll, still has Cristiano Ronaldo. Is it possible? Absolutely. Football or soccer is liquid. It could change, and we could have a change at the helm for sure. Inter is definitely licking their lips at the opportunity to dethrone Juventus from what would be a 10-year hegemony. But I somehow suspect this, and ultimately Juventus aims and builds a team to win the Champions League every year. And by default, this means that they're always going to be a top competitor for Serie A. Is it more competitive? I honestly am struggling to see whether to actually count this post-lockdown as into that, right? So we have to kind of net that out from what would ultimately be our final result. And once I net all of that out, I still see Juventus being leaps and bounds ahead.
Interesting
so
observation.
Somewhat of an unpopular opinion, if you will.
Sonia, what's your take?
I guess my facial expressions don't really convey over a radio medium, but that's okay. Yeah, I mean, okay, fine, give Juve their due, but at the same time, did they win the league so much as they didn't lose it? Mm-hmm. I keep going back to that Atalanta game, right? Like that Atalanta game where they got two arguably dubious penalties, and we can argue the handball rule until the cows come home, but it's so much that Juventus is just, they're set to win. And as a not even somebody who actively dislikes Juventus, but somebody who's just watching as a neutral, it's really hard to look what's going on and being like, yeah, that team deserves to win when you get, I'm not saying things handed, I know that's sort of a controversial thing, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but like just watching that Atalanta game, it was so deflating of here we go again. And like, I say that as an Udinese supporter where we weren't, awarded a single penalty this season. So it's just, I don't know, it's not even so much that it's boring, it's just that it's, how do you compete with somebody that the competition isn't on equal ground?
Yeah, and I think when you talk about equal ground, Juventus is the only major club who privately owns their stadium. And as long as they keep getting that added revenue, they're always going to have better players. They're always going to be able to manage a higher salary. And one thing that I have to give Inter is they have a policy which is really pre-financial fair play, where they go for it. We don't even know where that money is technically coming from, but yet they keep pumping money into the club. And that's great to see. Why? Because I think that's what sport is in essence, a way, is that you can have a smaller market, you can have a smaller team, or one that was finished 15th, and suddenly they can be a competitor. And that, because Italian red tape is so strict and hard to get around, that's one of the only ways right now, until we can get private stadiums. That's the only real threat to Juventus, is a team that, I don't want to say arbitrarily, but pumps in money from an outside source.
And you're looking at that now from the perspective of Atalanta, which is a team that, as you mentioned, does own its own stadium, does have its revenues now coming in, is able to maybe make certain acquisitions in the market that it wasn't prepared to do so even just a short time ago. You're looking at the possibility of Roma with new ownership now potentially moving forward with their stadium plan. You're looking and listening to Inter and AC Milan potentially making moves towards the eventuality of completion of a new stadium in that city as well. So it looks as if, at least on paper and statistically, that teams are starting to become more threats and more of a year to year rivalry seems to be generated over the course of the last number of years. And that leads me to the other subject that I wanted to address, and that is there appears to be a return to what was once known as the Seven Sisters of Serie A. In the early to mid 90s, several different Italian clubs were winning league championships, and others were consistently vying for European trophies. And back in that era, besides the traditional powers, those Seven Sisters included teams like Fiorentina and Parma. Substitute Atalanta and Napoli for those clubs today, and I would suggest to you that we're seeing the 2020 version of the Seven Sisters. So considering that at the time of this recording, we still had 4 Italian teams challenging for European hardware. So I wanted to get your thoughts on whether you believe we're seeing a return to the glory days of Serie A with this sort of new group of title challengers and this rising group of European teams who have sort of formed this top 7 this season.
You want me to jump in?
Absolutely.
Sure. Okay. So I guess we'd have to. Can I give my answer in about a few weeks' time after the European Cups are done? Okay. So I know I've kind of been a bit of a wet blanket so far on the whole discussion, but ultimately I think that that the market drives a lot of these things. And Serie A for so many decades actually just kept giving up that slice of the cake. And what we really need to do is to market ourselves better, market the product in a much better way in order to increase that pie, so that all of the teams that will take, all the clubs that take a slice of the league's pie will actually be able to perform better in Europe. To your point, however, I think that Atalanta has done a great job at increasing its market share through a lot of small ball. Like, really, really, really well done in terms of player recruitment and retention. Its youth system that just seems to be a better renewable source than the sun. And it just keeps pumping out all kinds of talent. Unfortunately, none of it Italian, for those who have to heart the fate of the Azzurri. And they're an absolute model to follow for the Sassuolos of the Serie A. For the upper bourgeoisie of the Serie A. Not quite the aristocrats at the very top, but for all those aspiring, typical UEFA Cup finishers to follow. So really hats off to them. And, one of the big things was that they didn't, once they achieved what they achieved last year, they didn't go off and sell their best pieces to survive, right? They maintained and they built a little bit up on that. And, the results are for everyone to see. They're really looking really good in the Champions League right now. They've qualified for Champions League for next year. And you know what? I mean, I know this is going to be a little bit from left field, but if again they shed some weaker spots and strengthen them, they could. There's nothing stopping them from actually being Scudetto challengers next year, all the way till the end.
I think I want to change my Twitter handle to Bougie Serie A, so thanks for that. I'll look into it. The other thing too is I would just like to say that owning your own stadium does not guarantee anything. I think since Udinese owns their stadium, we've been cursed and actually been doing worse. So don't always put all of your eggs in that basket. But the interesting point about like Serie A in the 90s. So my partner, Alf, who you know well, he is English and grew up with Serie A in the 90s. It was huge in England. And having him watch Italian games now versus what he saw, like, Fiorentina was a thing in England, which like blows my mind still. So I do think there is sort of this renewed interest. One thing too that I really follow along because of my whole digital marketing background is how Serie A clubs have taken to social media and have tried to reach out to international fans in a different way. I mean, I think Roma is above and beyond how they're connecting with fans, how they're interacting, how even the Roma English site, like during COVID, I know they reached out to a ton of different frontline workers and just across the globe, just, you know, highlighted them and whatnot. And it had nothing to do with football. It was just about like global community. Pescara has been doing a fantastic job. I mean, their social media manager is like part troll, part like just like incredible about everything that they're doing. So I think that's also really helping the market, that these teams have sort of become more accessible online, and they're kind of giving this opening to the fans that I don't think, other than maybe Bayern, who do it really well on Twitter as well, I don't think the big clubs, especially in England, have that sort of two-way transparency with their fans. And obviously I intentionally do not follow any Juve accounts, but I do think those the bigger clubs are starting to realize that they do have to reach out to fans. And I think Italy is surprisingly doing it very, very well, especially on different mediums. I mean, I mentioned Twitter, but like a lot of fans have taken to things like TikTok, even Snapchat to some extent, Instagram. And I think that they're starting to realize that the market is beyond just what's on the field, and they're really trying to expand that, which I think is fantastic and really interesting to watch, and something Italy is doing much better than a lot of other leagues.
I do think that question about the Seven Sisters is one I think about a lot, is if everyone is officially back, everyone is officially competitive. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Part of that is due to what we're all talking about with the way to outreach to new fans and international audiences. And we look at some of the foreign ownerships here. Milan, Roma, Fiorentina, Parma, Inter, and Bologna are foreign owned. I think that has a big part to do with it. But playing on top of that, I think even the people who've struggled, Milan can only struggle for so long because they're putting so much money into the club. And even a broken clock is going to tell the right time twice a day, right? And I think that's what they're going through now, is they finally have a good core of young players with Benacer and Theo Hernandez and Leao. These are legit players. So they're back on their feet. Roma is going to be really interesting next year. Fiorentina is, you know, they're a step above provincial in my mind.
Yeah.
They're never going to have the ticket sales, the match day revenue in order to make a case for them to boost up their salaries long term, where they can compete with the big dogs. It's just not going to happen. You can have cameo appearances such as Atalanta, who's doing, obviously, you know, everyone knows that they're doing so good right now, but that is a cameo appearance due to a string of factors going incredibly well, and not just the stadium coming together. They're doing everything right, and that's very rare, and not every club is going to be able to assume that strategy successfully. So, but I do love seeing it. You know, it makes for a great case, because when I was a teenager, I'm 30 years old now, but as a teenager, people would be like, you watch Serie A? I'd be like, yeah, it's the only league I know about, you know, but now it's like, oh, Serie A is interesting. Yeah. So it is very nice to see that it's respectable once again, but also attractive on a macro level.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that Wayne makes in terms of its attraction. And in the next segment, I want to explore that sort of attraction to foreign interests from a financial perspective. And I know Sonia touched on that a little bit with some of the off-field initiatives that certain clubs are pursuing, and I want to explore that a little deeper in the next segment. But I wanted to sort of continue on the field of play and some of the initiatives or some of the achievements this past year. And in the past week, Lega Serie A revealed its choices for the top player awards, including the league MVP, which went somewhat surprisingly, I would say, to Paulo Dybala. The other award winners included Ciro Immobile, who was selected as the best striker, Papu Gomez, the best midfielder, Stefan de Vrij, the best defender, Wojciech Szczesny was the best goalkeeper, and Dejan Kulusevski of Parma was chosen as the best under-23 player. We know he's a Juventus-owned player. not a single mention of Cristiano Ronaldo. So I'll ask you in a moment for your reactions to these selections, but I conducted a Twitter poll this past week asking my followers who they felt was the Serie A MVP, and I suggested three names, Dybala, Ronaldo, and Immobile, and I also offered a write-in choice, and the results were Immobile earned 50% of the vote, Dybala 22%, and Ronaldo only 11%. So let me get your reactions. Who do you believe was the league's best player, and who were key performers for you in some of the other categories?
I think that it was quite. It's again the big break really made it difficult to get a true appreciation of the flow of the full season. And to be honest, I think we basically had a very different two-legged season. Dybala was not successful, but was decisive in out of the 11 goals he scored, 8 of which basically broke the match. I think what was applied in that case was a very statistical approach, calculation. So based on, and we can talk until tomorrow about the bias of certain votes that might have been given by journalists and in the newspapers on a day-to-day in the post-game. But I think that what was applied was that. And by the same token, Szczęsny, who, to be completely honest, I don't think it was the best shot stopper in Serie A, just by gut feel. Also on the balance of the 40 goals that Juventus allowed, which is about double than we've allowed over in any regular successful season. I think that it was very much a statistical application of that, and from a gut feel and passion type of perspective, one would think that Immobile would have run away with it. That said, he did win an award, so I don't know if it was one of those cases where you have, we're not going to give him 2 awards in one. So that there's always a debate when you have a kind of something that's not objectively assigned, and rather it's a subjective judged type situation. So yeah, I think you could have put Immobile as MVP. I don't think I think he was the face of Serie A when one thinks about what was significant about this season, considering the fact that he equaled Higuain's record and looks like he's slated for the Golden Boot award, which would be the first time in about a decade or more than an Italian won that.
Yeah, I thought Immobile had a crazy season. On the other hand, I thought not that I thought, but a lot of those goals came from penalties. And how many of those penalties were a result of the new handball rule? So it was definitely inflated in that sense. For me, I went with Papu Gomez. I thought he was just brilliant this season. He's been amazing the past couple of seasons. They bring him over out of Eastern Europe. He comes back to Italy, and he's been lights out ever since. And under Gasperini, the way that he's having him play is not as a left wing or even as a number 10, but he drifts so far back. And as opposed to Dybala, and Rocco brings up a great point about the type of goals that Dybala scored, as in terms of them being decisive, right? You can look at the statistics, but what did they mean in the match? I think that's a lot of credit to Dybala in that sense. On the other hand, I just thought that the depth in which Papu Gomez creates and the tactic he has applied to him, where he's allowed to roam, but also Gasperini plays this diamond formation. And what Gomez does in that is he acts as the fifth to overload the opposition. And I think that there's something just amazes me, is he always is able to then find the ball. And if he can find the ball, he can spray it forward to Ilicic, who can be another candidate for an MVP this year. So just between the two of them, it's like magic. And I just love the tactic that he's given. He's given him that space, that liberation to just play his game throughout the pitch. And that's how you have to treat some players. And Gomez is that type of player.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo that. Papu Gomez was was going to be my pick as well. I mean, obviously you guys know my bias, but he kind of reminds me of this generation's Di Natale in the way that he kind of came up from obscurity. He really flourished under a coach. He helps everyone around him become a better player too, and is bringing up this like essentially little team up to a European spot. I do think, though, it's interesting, that they even gave awards out. I know it's sort of like a feel-good thing, but one thing that I think a lot of people have forgotten about this season, because the season has been so wild and, broken up and whatnot, was that we were going into the season as a Euro year. And so this start of the season, what a lot of players who obviously, of European descent have been focusing on was sort of how they're going to perform in the summer, what's going to happen after the season was done. So I think if they were, or obviously they did, but giving out awards and thinking about that, I do think that sort of as analysts on our side is we have to think about what players we're going into the season's mindset with versus how it's just sort of ended once we restarted again. I mean, even somebody like Ronaldo, who everyone assumed was going to win, and, I don't know if people were surprised he didn't, but like he was a contender from the very beginning. Again, a lot of his goals were based on penalties. He did nothing particularly spectacular this year that I can really think about. And I wonder if the cancellation of the Euros did play into a lot of mindsets for a lot of players because they didn't have this sort of big thing that they were working towards all year.
Interesting perspective on that. But just to go back to what Wayne had mentioned about Atalanta, I think I had made a point in the past in the past episode or past couple of episodes that Atalanta for me over the course of at least the last several weeks after the restart was one of the most watchable teams in Serie A, along with AC Milan, and it was no coincidence that both of them were on quite a run and made quite a run after the restart, and it's in those two teams particularly, but certainly in the kind of larger group that I see a lot of potential for all of the entirety of Serie A to sort of raise its competitive level and be able to kind of take a step forward and get back into that hierarchy that includes the Premier League and La Liga and the Bundesliga. And we'll touch, as I said, we'll touch a little bit more on that aspect of Serie A and what kinds of heights it can get to in the next segment. But we're going to take a short break now. And for those watching us, thank you for doing so. We invite you to listen to the remainder of the show on ITOC Italian on its streaming site, or download the entire podcast from the on-demand tab at italian.italk.ca. When we come back, we'll look ahead to next season in Serie A. Who are the new boys and who are some of the new faces that will be performing in Italy next season? We'll also consider this question: is Serie A a sleeping giant? All that and more coming up on Calcio Collective right after this break.